My great-great-grandfather, Daniel Wadsworth, had gotten a land grant from President Jackson.
No, he had 25 children. They didn't have TV back then, or radio.
Only one thing to do for entertainment.
Right.
Right here is where the old house used to sit.
We go through this warehouse, a credit.
And they would get bolts of cloth. He not only bought the property that his dad had owned. Well, hopefully I got pretty well straightened out.
You should have grabbed some cotton, Dad.
See if I got it. She said the eyes was big as saucers. It's an Indian burial ground. My name is William Wadsworth Baltzell Jr. The area we're in.
3 counties come together. You got Montgomery and Lowndes across the river. Pentalala Creek is between, and then our property is right straight across the river in Autauga County. This area has been in my family for early 1800s.
The Wadsworth family had owned it. Now the area we're in right now was owned by Dr. Pope. My great-great-grandfather, Daniel Wadsworth, received area around here, which was several thousand acres. He got a land grant when Andrew Jackson was the President of the United States. Now the different fields were named after the different people, or like the Bull Corner, the Steeple Cut is where they had the church. My great-granddad, Malcolm Wadsworth, would take care of the children and the parents, of course. He provided them from cradle to grave, just about. He had a church for them. He'd go get the doctor if they got sick or anything like that. Her house that's down here now, the remnants of her house, they had what they call a brick slave quarters.
What it kind of looked like a strip mall, I guess you might say. And it just had a front door. I don't know if it even had a back window in it or not.
Everybody wanted their property to touch the old home place. We can walk up in there if you want to and see where the old home place was. Right here is where the old house used to sit. Now, what's interesting is this was Sarah's house. These are sun-dry brick that this chimney is made out of. This was Sally's house or Sarah's house, but this entrance was into her area, her kitchen area, I guess you would say, where she made the candy and stuff. There used to be an old sink, as you can see. There's the soap dispenser up on the wall there. Over there was the, back over in that corner was the big, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a big mixer. Over here was the sink. Back in there was the dining room, and on back in there was the living quarters. As you see, the chimney is where the, and there was an artesian well back over there behind that corner. This field over here was known as the dipping vat field. The reason that was called a dipping vat field is because Grandpa Wadsworth had a wide area that he would run his cows through. It was a ditch. And he had creosote in that ditch, and that's the way they didn't have any rubs or anything like that, or spray or whatever, and they had to run the cows through there to get the flies off of them. All the children, all the 6 children's homes, all the 6 children's property came right to this point. For some, they wanted it to the old home place. Of course, it was gone when my grandmother was born. She was born in 1890 something, 1892 and 1896.
But over there is where the slave quarter line was, right behind where my dad was born. He came in, got the property. He had the property. Civil War came along. The North took the property away from the Southerners, of course, and gave it to the tenants, the slaves and such. He's got 167 acres and a mule. Now, they didn't know anything about paying taxes, property taxes. So therefore, my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, Daniel Wadsworth's son, Malcolm, bought it all back on the courthouse steps. He not only bought the property that his dad had owned, Daniel Wadsworth, but he also bought surrounding property. Malcolm Wadsworth said, you can stay here, you can, and this is my grandmother talking, Eugenia Wadsworth, which was great-grandpa Wadsworth's daughter. You can stay here, you can have chickens, pig, whatever like that, but you're gonna have to work for me, is the way it went. You'll be a tenant farmer.
Right.
Straw Boss was the one that would take the crew out, and he would know what area they were going to work, and he had to make sure that the men and women worked that field, and he kind of kept book on it so that they would know at the end of the week what they owed the different workers. But once a week they would go to Montgomery, and they had to go down Washington Ferry Road. They didn't have bridges back then. Cross the ferry, go into Montgomery. It'd take all day long. It'd take a couple of wagons. They would go through this warehouse, and they would have a credit, and they would get bolts of cloth, they would get barrels of flour, and they would get mainly staples and stuff like that that you couldn't grow yourself or make yourself. And they would bring them back, and my great-granddad, Grandpa Wadsworth, had a long warehouse. And it was either he or someone would sit at the end of that one end of the warehouse, and they would go through, the workers would go through, and they would get what they needed or what they wanted, and they kept book of how much they had earned the week before. But sometimes they didn't have a credit. They still owed, so they would have to settle that debt. So they usually came out of the warehouse owing instead of having a credit on the books. And that's kind of like the old story goes, you know, owe my soul to the company store.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the way this was that way. And they named all the fields. The Jack Cut is probably where a slave had lived. His name was Jack. The Davis Field. The Bull Corner, where they kept the bulls. The Steeple Cut, they had a church. My great-granddad had a church for them. He took care of them from the cradle to the grave. Dr. Pope owned this property right here. He had gotten a land grant from President Jackson. Eventually, in 1886, my great-granddad, Malcolm Wadsworth, purchased the Pope place, which consisted of it was about 1,500 or 2,000 acres. The area we're in right now was known as Sally New Ground. The way it got that name is my great-granddad married 3 sisters from Statesville, Alabama, which is about halfway from where we're going to Selma.
Not at the same time.
No, not at the same time. He married the first one, Caroline Lafayette Love. In fact, they said Lafayette came through here, and that's how she got her name, is what they're saying. And that's what my grandmother said. And she passed away from malaria. He married the second sister. She passed away because of blood poison after she had children. They didn't know anything about sanitation back then. And the doctor got there. She had twins. And there was sweat on the horses, and he had it on, and he delivered the baby. She got blood poisoning, and she died. Okay, that's 2 sisters. Then he married an Alexander, and he had a couple of children by her. Then he married my great-grandmother. He used to bounce my great-grandmother on his knee and tell her he was going to marry her. Well, He had no idea he was going to marry her. She died in 1913. He was 75 years old. She was about 75 when she died. And my mother knew her. What my mother would do is she'd take her around to pay her bills. Her name was Mama Bess.
What was her maiden name?
Catherine Elizabeth. Catherine Elizabeth Love. The part where we were and ate breakfast, here's where they field dressed the deer and everything. I think I'm all right. I'm not going to take mine off. You see, he's got the white timber rattler. And we saw one, didn't have anything to kill it with. Anyway, killed this big timber rattler. It was over 6 feet long.
That's my response. It's the one thing I
Ooh.
But I would eat in there just about every morning. When they would start finishing a room
In the river, where the 3 counties meet.
And some of these stories that he tells on video, and he's an old friend of mine too, by the way. We didn't just pull him in off the street.
Is known as Sally Newground. Where that came from was Grandpa Wadsworth gave Aunt Sally, her name was Sarah Wadsworth. That was his oldest daughter by Mama Bess, Mary Catherine Wadsworth. That was the last, my great-grandmother, the last sister that he married. That was a love. She said the reason she married Mr. Wadsworth, they used to call him by the surname, women could not own property, but the reason she married him was to take care of her nephews and nieces and stepchildren and all that, but she had 8 children for him also. He had between 20 and 25 children total between these 4 women. Well, she had 8 children for him herself, so they didn't have TV back then or radio.
Only one thing to do for entertainment.
Right. Women back then in 1900 could not own property, so she came in for what's known as a child's portion. And my great-grandfather entailed the last 800 acres to his last 6 or 7 children. They could do anything they wanted to, but they could not sell the property. They could cut the timber off of it, they could raise cattle, they could lease it or anything like that, but they could not sell the actual property. That's what my grandmother told me. She used to live down here on Nolan Creek. There's an old house back there, well, the remnants of an old house. That house was made out of slave brick. She took the old slave brick quarter line and built her house out of it. Wow. Back in the 30s. She would come home in the afternoon after she worked. She was a nurse. She'd come down here and she'd go to that old slave brick quarter line and she would clean those brick. Those brick were sun-dried brick. They were kind of an orangish red. And that's what she built her house with back in the 1930s. Now there's still remnants of that old house down there. 1886 is when my great-granddad purchased this property we're going to. It was Dr. Pope.
Yeah.
Dr. Pope used to own, this used to be what's called the Pope property, and it was somewhere around 1,500 acres. And there's a house up on Highway 14 right there at the cemetery where 14 comes off of 31. Dr. Pope's house was down here. And in 1886, Grandpa Wadsworth purchased that property, he and another man, and they moved that house from down here up to Highway 14, where it is presently today on Highway 4, right off of Highway 14 in the subdivision, right off of Highway 31, right there where they intersect. It's approximately 14 miles, something like that. And the way they moved it, my grandmother told me, 2-story house, they moved it on logs, took it apart. They numbered the boards, and also that they rolled part of that house on logs. They would take a log, put it in front, and roll it, pull it with mules. And they kept on doing that until they got it to where How long it took, I don't know. It could have taken several weeks, several months, or whatever. But anyway, that's where Dr. Pope's house is sitting now. It is a 2-story house. As you come off of 31 up in Prattville next to the hospital, it's approximately, I would say, 3/4 of a mile. And just as you start around that first sharp curve to the right, you just look off into the woods over there to the north, and you can see that house. But anyway, that house was down here. That's the only one that I've known that's ever been moved like that. Now over here to the right is what's known as the graveyard. There are slaves and Dr. Pope's son, Francis Pope, buried where those tall trees are over there. Somebody had the grandiose idea and dug, I guess they thought they'd find some kind of treasure in the grave. And they took the headstone and pushed it over into it. There's here, you can see it's got writings all around on the headstone.
We had to pull it up out of the hole.
So we got it up out of the, got this up out of the hole and got that set pretty well back up like it's supposed to.
Born 1830, died 1855.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Of course, you probably already know this. In the cemeteries, if you notice, they're all facing east. So when Christ comes back, he will come from the east.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this over here says
From the direction that the sun rises. I think the water marker's up there close to where Aunt Jessie's old house was.
Okay.
There's one back there, a township marker. I think that's where the town, and then this is in one township, and town 16, town 15, something like that.
But Bill, also these bricks like this would be markers for graves. These sun-dried
Yeah.
bricks would be. They didn't actually inscribe anything. They just,
No.
here's a body, you know. Some friends were asking one time, they had seen a documentary about slave tags, and like this mainly in the Charleston area where I guess there was a denser population during the slave trade. But when I started asking about that, because they were asking about it, not that, I mean, there's no way. I told them, back off. We are not digging around out there. He was telling me that we didn't do that here because it was just, it wasn't that hard to identify. They weren't as abundant, you know. Anyway, that was apparently something that was going on that could be lucrative for thieves if they were taking these, you know, let the poor guy rest.
He also owned down the Pope place, and he owned 2 places in Montgomery, one on Robinson Street and one on Martha Street, and they call it the Cottage Hills. Now, the way my granddad bought Zell, met my grandmother, is he had his brother came down and started a silent movie house, that's what it was, in Prattville. Okay, they were renting, was about 17 years old. Charles bought Zell. He came down to visit them.
From Tiffin, Ohio.
From Tiffin, Ohio, and guess what? He stayed. And he married my grandmother. And had my dad and my uncle. My uncle's name was Charles Jr. And my daddy's name was William Wadsworth, after the Wadsworth family. And also my granddad had a brother named Will. That's how the William came in, and I'm a junior. Okay, beyond this yellow gate, there's only 6 owners. The county, we voted not to have the county go beyond this gate. We have to keep this road up ourselves. The 6 owners do.
Some good swamp.
Now, when the high water gets up in Montgomery, it cuts us off right here at 47 feet in Montgomery. Water was up to the top of these, bottom of these power lines in 1963 when we had a big flood. We had to come, I didn't get to come down here. They wouldn't let me come, I was too young. But they had to move all the cows off. My granddad and my grandmother lived over there, and black people used to come down and go fishing on Nolan Creek. And they came up, she said the eyes was big as saucers. She said, Miss Lou, there's a wild man down there on the creek. And she says, why is that? He said, well, somebody, we have some feet and they were about this long. Well, my granddad was he was over 6'3", and he had his feet he wore a size 13 shoe. And so he had taken his shoes off, the hogs had gotten out, and he's gonna get the hogs back in. And so you take a 13-foot shoe and you slide it about halfway, it looks like about 18 or 20, plus in that mud, and it mushes out. So it looked like a huge footprint. And that's why they thought there was a wild man down there. And that was one of the stories that she told. There's an area that's underwater now. The U.S. Geological, Corps of Engineers, took that away from us. It's about 110 acres because they were going to, I guess you might say, make the Alabama River navigable. Send barges up through here. Well, that didn't work. But anyway, they bought the right to flood about 110 acres of our property. Of course, some of it we'll never see because they put in Jones Bluff Lock and Dam. And of course, that backed the water up, which the water I'm looking at right now out here came from. It's a backwater off of Nolan Creek. My granddad, we're gonna go down there to the field. It's where Indians are buried. It's an Indian burial ground. They would come down through there all over this central area, and they would make their pottery. And of course, if one died, they had to bury him there. So what he had hit the one of those big jugs, and so he dug it up and took it up to the house and put it in the tool shed. Well, he got to feeling sorry for the old Indian, so he took it back down there and buried it. The way the Alabama Archives and History, well, it was actually Geological Survey, came down there, and they hunted for the graves, see where the graves were. Where they would find the graves is they would take a metal rod, and they had a notch in it, and they would push it down in the ground. And if they pulled it up and they had a piece of charcoal on it, it's a good possibility that in that area where the Indians were buried, that would be a burial site. Because what the Indians would do is they would take the artifacts and all of the Indian, the body, and put it in a jug, bury it, and then they would build a fire over it and cover it with dirt, and it would make charcoal to absorb any human odors or anything like that, so the wild animals would not dig them up. My dad, we had a Farmall 20 tractor. You had to hand crank, you had to start off with gasoline, and you had to use drag implements, which were mule-drawn implements, and you had to grease them twice a day because they had wooden hubs in them. If you didn't, and if you pulled them too fast, it would burn those wooden hubs out. So we couldn't pull them very fast because they were, like I said, they were mule drawn, and they had wooden. They didn't have bearings in them. The way I came to own the property in 1983, And I inherited the property about 2 or 3 years after that. Law perpetuity said it stops at that generation. Half will go to her sister, and then half would go to my grandmother. Well, my grandmother had 2 children, and my great aunt had 1 child, Betty Jean. So half of it went to Betty Jean, and half of it went to my grandmother's children, which was my dad and my uncle. And that's how I wound up with 1/4 of what was left. My dad, the first tractor we had, believe it or not, we bought it at Sable's Junkyard. And my dad put a magnet on it. Had a cousin that did it for him. It had tricycle tires on the front, and we had steel wheels on the back. And you'd have to start the thing with gasoline, and you flip over to what they call tractor fuel, which was just a step grade above kerosene. And that's what it used to run on. And it didn't have muffler or anything, it just had a straight pipe out it. It did have gears. It was what they call a drawbar. And you had to pull, like I say, it was mule-drawn implements. We had a hay rake, a disc, a plow.
How old were you think, when you drove that for the first time by yourself?
7 years old. I learned to drive with the Jeep. My dad drove the tractor, and I pulled the disc behind with a piece of cross tie to help smooth the field out. He'd plow it. It'd take us 2 or 3 days to plow a 50-acre field. Where we start right here, where we cut through, you got about 3 football lengths of football field right along the edge of the river, which was known as the clay pit. Yeah. And there's a road. Since then, of course, we've had people to lease it from us. It's usually, mostly was a relative that would lease it from us.
Crop rotation?
Some, not a whole lot. The man that's doing it now, he mainly plants cotton all the time. Now, he did plant corn down in one of the fields this past year, the irrigated field. He started irrigating about 3 years ago. Nowadays, you just can't depend on the weather. Now, what I did is I put bird houses every 100 yards, bluebird boxes. Now, this one fell down, but well, Russell and Andrew have been a big part of they were a big part of it down here when they were growing up. Especially enjoying hunting, bringing their friends down here. That's a hawk, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's good to know that people still are close to the land, I guess the term would be, the way I feel about it. The heritage, I guess you might say, the feeling of being a part of it, and the adventure, you might say, of the outdoors. Being able to go out and hunt and see all of nature and what God has created for us, and the things that we need to enjoy, the simple things of life. Stop and smell the roses, I guess the term would be.
Yeah.
You know. Well, hopefully I got pretty well straightened out.
You should have grabbed some cotton, Dad.
Huh? Yeah, that's good. See if I got it. I had to use corn cob. This is my squeaky frog glasses. I don't know what he's doing. He had 25 children. They didn't have TV back then. Or radio.
Only one thing to do for entertainment.
Right. Fruitcake.